Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy. And we are into episode 3 of Marksism, a conversation with myself and fellow editors Mark Melton and Marc LiVecche. Today, of course, we'll review what's been happening in America and the world, especially regarding the aftermath to the Minneapolis killing of George Floyd, the mass demonstrations across America, the riots, especially in Washington, D.C., most famously or infamously in Lafayette Park, and including even the street outside the Providence office. Windows were smashed downstairs. Our office is on the second floor, so was not directly affected, but all of us in the Washington area and certainly across America are feeling the effect and the aftermath of this national conversation that is involving sometimes violence, about which Marc LiVecche has written an article of thoughtful reflection. So Marc LiVecche, tell us a little bit about what you had to say.
Thanks for doing all this again, Mark. Yeah, my essay, whose title I can't remember, I think it's Restraint and Resolve, the Requirements of Courage. I'm sure our intrepid managing editor would know the title off the top of his head, but I think it's something to that effect. The essay looks at the George Floyd situation by comparing some of my thoughts to an article that David French produced a bunch of years ago about another police shooting, in which he was lamenting the lack of restraint by police in America's streets, and comparing it to the type of restraint that soldiers tend to demonstrate when downrange. And so I analyze that. I channel it through the lens of the virtue of courage. And I simply say that courage is compounded of many things, two of which are restraint, that the courageous are able to demonstrate restraint under certain circumstances by being willing to take a degree of risk. It's calculated risk. We're not asking soldiers or policemen to be rash in their courage, but to demonstrate a kind of restraint that allows a recognition of what the real mission is. And the real mission for soldiers and policemen is never simply to stay safe themselves, but to protect the public, to serve the community, to aim toward peace, and that sometimes requires taking on degrees of personal risk. That's not to say that the only reason George Floyd was killed is because the police were scared of him, but it is asking what courage would look like in certain policing situations. And then it also looks at the requirement of resolve in light of the rioting, and it asks whether the police standing down is the appropriate response, or whether the police should insert themselves, or the National Guard, if the case requires it, insert themselves between the rioters and the things they are looting, and have enter into intentionally a confrontation, all of which requires enormous levels of courage in different ways. But it looks at courage, it looks at George Floyd and what maybe the police could have done differently. And then again, it points toward the requirements of justice as being a vindication of the victim, and how that factors in, which we'll touch on, I think, in both Josh Mitchell's and Shadid's interview that you did with him. So we can touch on more of that later, but that's the gist of it.
Marc LiVecche, if you could touch on the increasing trend I've noticed, at least on social media, of dismissing the importance of property and basically saying that systemic racism in America is such that rioting and the destruction of property are justified, that the life of George Floyd surpassed any amount of property, whether it's in the thousands or millions or potentially in the billions. And so we've seen this interesting trend where even serious Christians are writing and saying that in some cases violence is not only justified, but perhaps called for to address such gross injustice. What do you say?
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of things. One, at the very end of what you said, I have agreement. There are, of course, occasions in which justice requires the risking of or the intentional breaking of things. We know that. We've got the just war tradition. Occasionally things need to get broken, or the risk of things being broken needs to occur in order to requite injustices. So we know that. But the trend that you're seeing, and rightly so, of the dismissal of the value of property has occurred in both back-to-back crises we have. So it's occurred now where people are saying the looting doesn't matter, or the looting is justified because of the injustices. And then throwing back to what I think was often the false dichotomy made way back when. I'm old enough to remember the COVID epidemic. And if you go way back to that, you had these conversations happening about whether or not we were going to tank the economy or save lives, as if these were separate things that you could only do one or the other. It was a zero-sum proposition. And some of the people who were concerned about preserving the economy had in mind not just stuff and profit margins, but the saving of lives and livelihoods. Now you've got the same thing, it seems. Different circumstances. You've got people contending that the property doesn't matter, whereas other people are pointing to all sorts of goods that are wrapped up in the protection of property rights. I think Rebecca Heinrichs was talking about, just the things that civic peace requires, the goods that emerge out of civic peace. When people are running rampant and destroying things and breaking things, they aren't just targeting stuff. They're ruining lives. They're demolishing civic peace. They're ruining the opportunity for people to make a living, especially on the heels of the epidemic. This is a double whammy. Civic peace requires justice, order, and peace. And if you don't have those things, then all other civic goods, such as health and life, the ability to educate your children, the opportunity to walk down the street safely, all of those things are up in the air. So it's a false dichotomy. I think we have a civic obligation to protect property. Not to the nth degree, of course not. But it's a false dichotomy, and where we can press against that, we have to.
Well, Mark Melton, when you and I finally get back to the Providence office in downtown DC, we'll see the extensive property damage, including to the shops downstairs from us, including the Subway sub shop that you and I both patronize, which is owned and largely staffed by Pakistani immigrants. Their windows were smashed, their cash register smashed, the funds taken. Hopefully it wasn't a great loss, but certainly involving many thousands of dollars, if not more, for people who came to this country and have worked hard and ostensibly are the subject of compassion and interest by those who are advocates of social justice within Christianity and elsewhere. What are your thoughts in terms of the price paid by these Pakistani immigrants and many, many other small business owners, many of whom live on the margins and can't afford this kind of loss?
Well, I think there's evidence that it's not just in DC too. Like I also know, even in the Virginia suburbs, you heard about, I think like Lost Dog Cafe was hit in McLean, which is a restaurant that helps animal rescue. But obviously like there's a difference between peaceful protest and rioting. And so you can say that, people can peacefully protest. Now in the pandemic, there's people who've raised the question about social distancing there, but that aside, I've recognized that like a lot of the poll numbers recently have shown that most Americans don't support the rioting and the violence, but they do support a lot of the motives behind the protest. And so obviously it's a tragedy when people's stuff gets lost. I think Shadi had tweeted out a couple days ago of how some people have mentioned this kind of like thankfulness of like not caring that stuff got broken and rioted, but Shadi had tweeted out about how that's problematic. Like it's not okay when people unnecessarily lose their stuff. And I also think that some of this, I think Reuters had an article recently of how a lot of this is perhaps opportunism, where when the police are being distracted, taking care of a protest, people can then go smash windows and steal stuff out of the subway. And so And you see this not just in the United States, you see this in other parts of the world too. I remember kind of researching riots in France and other places and how similar things happen in those situations too.
Well, we published what I thought was an intriguing and fascinating piece by Joshua Mitchell from Georgetown University, asking the question, shall America be pagan or shall America be Christian? Pointing out that pagan civilizations typically operated or were premised around tribes or races, and an outrage against one tribe demanded punishment of the whole tribe, and vice versa, whereas in Christian society, individuals are punished for their individual crimes and misdeeds, and whole peoples are not punished for the misdeeds of one individual. Marc LiVecche, what were your thoughts on what Josh Mitchell had to say?
Yeah, I was excited by it. I'm a nerd. I get excited by such things. He's channeling René Girard. René Girard has a theory in which he suggests that human culture is founded upon a scapegoat, a ritualistic murder, and that cultures founded on these things take the point of view or take the side of the victimizer, those who are killing the scapegoat. That's paganism. He sees pagan society as the gods battling the gods. And so one people expiates their sin by attacking another people. And they find, he calls it cathartic rage, and this is a way of expiating their own sins. In Girard's larger theory, some of the component bits of this is that there is a people, and the people are cognizant of their need for the expiation of their sins. And if they don't expiate their sins on the outside, then it's a war of all against all, where one rages against all others. And so what a society needs to do in order to avoid breaking apart is they need to make an accusatory gesture, and they need to be able to point at something, the scapegoat, around which they can all agree. They can all then make that accusatory gesture. They murder the thing, and this could be symbolic. In certain societies, Girard would talk about how they'll take somebody who stole a pack of cigarettes, and the society will drag this person into the village square, make the accusatory gesture, and chop off a hand. So the murder, the ritualistic murder, could be somewhat more symbolic, but there is a blood sacrifice of some kind being made. And once the culture can do this, once the society can make this accusatory gesture, have the ritualistic murder, then they find a cathartic release, and they feel cleansed, and they feel purified, and they feel holy again, until the whole cycle spins up again. And so you have cycles of ritualistic murder. That's paganism. Christianity shatters this because society makes the accusatory gesture, the victim is crucified, and then the thing doesn't work. Christianity takes the side of the victim. And you see this in the testimony about the cross, where everybody goes away beating their heads and their brows because the ritualistic murder failed to do what it was meant to do. And so now Christianity says, sorry, this is no longer about group expiation. Now this is about you and your individual relationship with the divine. And Josh Mitchell calls this a revolution. Other people have called it a scandal. Some societies, some individuals, some peoples find this contemptible. But I think when you take all the various articles that we've had come out this week, from mine to Josh's to your interview with Hamid, you see a lot of the same themes coming together, I think, where Hamid talks about the Church of the Woke, the wokeness movement, and it has all the dimensions of religious fervor. It asks all the questions. What went wrong? Who will resolve this? When will that happen? And they have their clerics, they have their rituals, they have the accusatory gestures. And I think that's what we're seeing in the riots. You have a people who are confounded and angry, and they want release. And so they build up a cathartic rage, they make an accusatory gesture, if it's toward the whites, if it's toward the police, if it's toward whatever it is their target is, and that we could talk about. And they have something like a ritualistic murder. There is a breaking of things and a burning of things, and they make their sacrifice. And in the mayhem and chaos, I think they are looking for a way to expiate their own sins by foisting it all upon a scapegoat. And in this case, the scapegoat might be white culture, it might be police, law enforcement, or those who hold power. What I love about his article, and Girard's theory more broadly, is that it takes, you know, everything from Islamicist terror to the woke movement to the riots, and it gives it all an interpretive structure, a way of trying to understand what is going on. So I think there's a lot more to be said about that, and I hope we find ways to say it.
Well, Mark Melton, as Marc LiVecche just referenced, my interview with Shadi Hamid yesterday of the Brookings Institution. He, of course, is our left of center Muslim friend, but concerned and interested in Christianity in America and the central role it plays in upholding our civic life, and is very concerned about this emerging church of woke, which offers itself almost as a substitute for traditional religion by displacing it with whatever the justice causes are of the moment. So, Mark Melton, will you be attending the Church of Woke anytime soon?
No, I don't. I'm not sure when they meet on Sundays, but it's interesting. I watched Tim Keller had a series a few years ago about, and it kind of went along with one of his books, but he talked with non-Christians, and it was kind of an apologetics, trying to understand, you know, not just like what do you say to non-Christians about, like, how do you defend your faith, but also where are they even coming from? And so series was like a roundtable talk, and he just asked like the different people their perspectives on this stuff. And what I found fascinating that I wasn't expecting in that was how these people who were supposedly atheists and supposedly agnostic still had very religious, very spiritual beliefs. And so even when you remove the religion, even when you remove Christianity or whatever that religion was for them, it's replaced with something else. And it's usually something that's kind of illogical in a way, because it's obviously not been developed by traditions over centuries. And so they had like very developed ideas of what the soul was and the spirit was and what was right and wrong, but yet it was very, it wasn't on a firm foundation, it seemed, or it was on a foundation of Christianity that was removed. And if you remove God from that foundation, then the entire, the logic kind of falls apart a bit. So it's interesting. Like, obviously, it makes sense that you would have some type of new moralism, new right and wrong, if you remove the religion from the society. And but I also think I was thinking about this where I had a conversation some years ago with African American in the Reformed tradition about how, you know, because of Christianity, people of different races can come together. In fact, we become a new people because God, we are all adopted sons and daughters of God. And I think Mitchell wrote about this, where we can come together as sinners in a way because we're redeemed and saved through Christ. And so, and there's neither Jew nor Gentile. And I think there's also, Paul wrote about how, you Jews and you Gentiles, you have to get along together. You have to eat together. Like, you can't keep being separate. And when he says that, he's not saying, you Jews and then you white Gentiles, and then you African American or black Gentiles are separate. Like, Gentiles are, they're inclusive there. So I think within Christianity, there's a foundation where race relations can improve. And when you remove that, then you lose, there's a loss of opportunity to come together. But that's my hope, is that the church can serve as a way for sinners who are totally depraved. I think I saw somewhere earlier today talking about how 10% of Americans are bad people. And I'm like, well, in the Reformed tradition, 100% of people are bad people. But where sinners can come together and eat at the same table and worship together.
Well, hopefully, Mark Melton, our churches can reopen soon, so we bad people will not have to resort to the Church of Woke and can return back to our more traditional forms of Christianity. But Marc LiVecche, Mark Melton, thank you for another stimulating conversation and an episode of Marksism. Until next week, bye-bye.
Take care.